my wife Anne, bought a workbook for my daughter, Maggie. And she bought this workbook a few months ago. And it's got all kinds of activities for kids aged 3 to 5. It's got matching games. It's got sort of just pictures for Maggie to color and draw over. All kinds of activities. One of the activities it has the letters of the alphabet to help her learn the letters of the alphabet. And the letters are they're printed in very large font, but also in very faint ink, so that Maggie can sort of trace over the letters. Now, for the first few months that Maggie had this workbook, she didn't really pay any attention to the letters. She was more focused on the pictures and on coloring. And by coloring, of course, I mean mostly just sort of scribbling all over it wherever she pleased. But in the last week or two, Maggie got really interested in these letters. And she actually started to trace them and was really doing a good job. And the first few times, each time she successfully traced a letter, she would come and say, "Look, Papa, look, I did it." And she was so excited. And she was so proud of what she had done. And of course, I was excited and proud too. As a parent, you love to see your child learning and growing and developing. And just to see her curiosity about these letters was wonderful to see. But watching her sort of painstakingly trace these letters, and in some cases really struggling to get it, it reminded me of something that I had really sort of forgotten. I hadn't paid attention to for a long time. That reading and writing, this is really an incredible skill that many of us have. I think a lot of us take it for granted. Most adults in the US are literate. I think the literacy rate in the US is, over 97%. Not everyone can read and write, and we should remember that. It's a real gift. But for many of us, we were taught at a young age, and reading and writing for a lot of us is as natural as breathing or walking. In fact, if you show me something written in English, I can't help but interpret it, read it, and make sense of it. But watching Maggie as she slowly and painstakingly traced these letters, it reminded me of just how incredible, how amazing the ability to read really is. Think about it. With these 26 little shapes, we can pretty much say anything we want, any experience, any knowledge, past, present, or future, anything we can imagine, any feeling we can have, we can express. And someone else can pick up that book a day later, a year later, 100 years later, 1,000 years later, and that knowledge is open to them. Knowing how to read opens up a nearly infinite world of knowledge for us. It's really incredible. With this humble little piece of paper with these strange little squiggly marks, an infinite world of knowledge is available to us. But it's only available to us if we know how to read, if we learn how to read, or better put, it's only available to us if someone teaches us how to read. Because that's the thing, someone has to teach us, each one of us, how to read. It's not a skill we can give ourselves. And if you want a stark reminder of this, just find a book written in a language you don't speak. Or better yet, find a book that's written in an alphabet or a writing system that you don't know how to read. If you show me a book written in Japanese, for example, I can't make heads or tails of it. I can't read it at all. I can't make any sense of it. When it comes to books written in Japanese, I'm illiterate. And all of a sudden, those marks that convey that infinite world of meaning, there's no meaning for me. There's just this piece of paper with some ink on it, and it doesn't mean any more than that. We have to be taught how to read those symbols in order to understand the truth that's being conveyed. But once we do learn how to read, once someone teaches us how to read, there's this depth that opens up in any text, and we can learn so much. Learning to read, being taught to read, it's really like getting a second pair of eyes. We have this new vision that allows us to see the world in so much greater depth. It's really an incredible gift. Now, 5 weeks ago, on the second Sunday of Easter, I said that, when the message of Jesus' resurrection was first being spread, a lot of people, very reasonably, did not buy it. We see that in the Gospels themselves. When Mary Magdalene first comes to the male disciples and tells them that she's seen Jesus, she can't explain how. She can't possibly make sense of it, but she met Jesus. He had been crucified, but she had just talked to him. They didn't believe her. They basically said, I'll believe it when I see it. And then after they experienced Jesus resurrected, and they couldn't make sense of it, they couldn't explain how it was possible. It was impossible, but they had experienced it. They went to tell Thomas, and Thomas said, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. Part of the lesson of the resurrection, though, is that we often don't know what we're looking at. Even when we see things, we often don't understand what we're looking at. Just like when I look at a book written in Japanese, I don't understand what I'm looking at. I can't interpret it. I can't make sense of it. The resurrection is basically trying to teach us a new language, a new way of seeing and interpreting the world. The resurrection is a new language that allows us to see past the surface of life and into this greater depth of our existence, who we are, of who God is, and of what this world is really about. And being taught this language of resurrection is what's going on to the disciples in the days and weeks following Jesus' resurrection. They're learning this new language of resurrection, and it teaches them things. This new language allows the disciples to see Jesus' presence, even though he has been killed. And it allows them also to understand what's really true and important about life. They begin to perceive that life and love and hope win, even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Life and love and hope win. They perceive this because of this new language that they're learning. The language of resurrection also allows them to understand that Jesus is present even when they can't see or hear him. This is what we learn in the Ascension. Jesus appears and disappears for the last time, but the disciples realize that he is nevertheless still present with and through them. They only were able to perceive this, though, because they had learned this new language. They had been taught this new language of resurrection. And I think this is what we have been seeking in these last 7 weeks. We've been seeking hope in a hopeless time. I think we have been trying to learn the language of resurrection, learn this new way of looking at the world, this new way of interpreting the world, to discover that the depth of existence actually teaches us hope, even when the surface might be telling us we should be hopeless. And that's the thing. Hope in a hopeless time, this hope that we've been searching for, it will never arrive for us by just staring at the surface of life. We won't be struck by the deep truth of hope in Jesus Christ by just paying attention to the surface of life day in and day out. Precisely the same way that I'm never going to learn to read Japanese by just opening a book written in Japanese and staring at it all day. No, I'll need someone who speaks Japanese and who can write in Japanese to teach me. We have to learn this new language. Hope arrives by learning the language of resurrection, this new way of interpreting, of making sense of our world. And I think this is exactly what our passage from the letter to the Ephesians is trying to tell us today. It's our second reading today. And it's not up on the screen right now, but if you've got your bulletin, you might want to scroll up or turn, depending on whether you're looking at this on a computer or paper. But right in the middle of our second reading today, in the letter to the Ephesians, the author says this: I pray that God may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation as you come to know God, so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which God has called you. This author tells us that the eyes of our heart must be enlightened. And I think what he's trying to tell us is you have to learn this new language. The eyes of your heart must be enlightened. You must take on this new way of looking at the world, this new way of interpreting and making sense of the world, the language of resurrection. And it's only after we've learned that new way of looking at the world, it's only when the eyes of our heart have been opened and enlightened, only then is that depth of life, that deeper truth, revealed to us. Just like a book written in a language I can't read is basically closed to me. It's obscured. If I learn the language it's written in, then the book is revealed to me. The depth of the meaning of that book is revealed to me. And I think this author, too, notice that he specifically talks about the hope that God has called us to. When we learn the language of resurrection, then we begin to understand hope in a hopeless time. We discover a source of hope, not at the surface of life, but in the depth of our existence. Hope arrives when we learn how to interpret the world, not at the surface, but at its depth. Just like reading a book, it's not about paying lots of attention to the paper and the ink itself. No, you almost look through the paper and ink. You look at the shapes and you interpret them to mean concepts and ideas and words that exist sort of as a depth of the text. Let's be clear. To proclaim that a crucified peasant is actually the King of glory is to say that things are often not as they seem. At the surface of life, Jesus is just some poor, unfortunate guy who tried to teach about love and was killed for it. But in the language of resurrection, we begin to understand that there's much, much more to his life. But you might ask that as we learn this language of resurrection, as we begin to perceive this new source of deep hope, what does that really mean? How does that change us? Or what will happen to us? Well, I think that if we put our hope and our trust in the God revealed in Jesus Christ, then what that must mean for us is that we actually have to try to live like Jesus, right? And that means that we will not surrender to that sort of surface of life, which can sometimes be sad and pessimistic and cynical, but instead we'll live according to this deeper truth that we learn through the language of resurrection, this deep truth that is revealed, this deep truth of hope. And if we live according to this deeper truth, if we dare to hope that life and love win, then we actually have to live as if life and love win. And we actually have to help life and love win. And that means actually going out and living differently, taking action in the world. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 40 talks about making the paths of the Lord straight. We have to do some work to make this world ready for God's reign of love and peace and compassion. We have to do things. We actually have to go out to a broken world and begin to try to fix it. Not because we can save the world, but because God calls us to participate in God's salvation of the world. And that's why today, right after our service, we're going to hold a special Sunday forum on racial justice. We're going to try to talk together about ways that we as a parish can concretely try to fight for racial justice here in DC. We're going to talk about some of the different ways that racism impacts people through poverty and income inequality, through mass incarceration, through violence, both violence from the state as well as violence from private individuals, just like we talked about last week with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And we're going to talk about some of the different groups and organizations that we might work with to engage in real concrete and local action to begin in our own little small part of the world to try and create greater racial justice, to fight against racism, to fight against white supremacy, knowing that if we actually dare to hope in the God revealed in Jesus Christ, that's what we're called to do, to make the paths of the Lord straight in the wilderness of white supremacy and racism. Because that's the thing. Real hope, the hope of Jesus crucified and risen, is not some abstract idea. This hope is not some poetic image. No, hope in a hopeless time is real, and it will really and radically change us if we actually take the risk of following it. And if we do that, then we will also know that we are called to really and radically change this world.